What is the today's condition of Putin's war machine, and for how long would Russia have forces to continue fighting against Ukraine? If you read the press and listen to the commentators, one can get the message that everything is fantastic at Putin's kingdom. He's reset the economy to the military rails, he's starting production of his own munitions, and he's expecting to get additional aid from other allies such as North Korea. He has a ton of never-ending human resources, and that's what they were talking continuously about, 140 millions of people living in Russia. Is it so? This is Vladimir Milov, and constant viewers of our channel know that very often we do some sort of a fact-checking of all these talks about triumphs of Putin, and there are a couple of things which can help us a lot in figuring out the reality. First is what the bureaucrats, oligarchs, and high-ranking representatives of Putin nomenclature saying about the situation that has been entrusted them to manage. And very often we give you quotes from these people to show the real situation on the ground. And second is official stats, which very often shows a very different picture than you see in all these triumphal praisings of Putin. So let us talk about the today's condition of Putin's army and military industry. Will Putin have enough people for the war? First, key and most obvious problem that is very often discussed and openly discussed is the deficit of manpower, the deficit of military forces to continue conducting military aggression and defend the country. And we know that problems were rather serious. Even the new Minister of Defense, Belousov, at his appointment, giving a speech, he acknowledged that they have issues with staffing the army, but he did say, however, that they're not planning new mobilization effort. And the situation indeed is serious. First problem is related with the fact that any advancement on the front, capturing of any couple kilometers or even 100 yards, comes to Russia at huge cost, at huge losses. We see some absolutely horrifying numbers that were following the capture of several Ukrainian townships. 23,000 were lost by Wagner while taking Bakhmut, and 16,000 people were lost to storm Avdiivka. And if one looks at the recent, let's say, frank failure of advancement in Kharkov region by Russian army, there the cost of those several kilometers was also paid with a huge number. People are calling 4,000 soldiers to take several kilometers. Maybe a little more, a little less, but one can see that every kilometer takes thousands of battle losses. And here one can say that I just named 3 specific directions of offensive operations: Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Kharkov direction recently in May, June of this year. Among 3 of them, Russia has lost 40,000 troops, dead and wounded. This is twice more than Soviet Union lost over 10 years war in Afghanistan. And Russia only captured several small townships. So we see that in the current character of military operations, every operation is followed with some incredible losses. And if Putin is about to undertake another big offensive of that scale, then with this character of fighting, he would have hundreds of thousands of people to find to join his army in order to execute that offensive. And the big question, does he have those hundreds of people? So overall, this is a rather popular but incorrect opinion that Putin has an endless human resource in Russia. Very often people are bringing up the number of Russia's population, 140 millions, and apparently it looks like a big number, so you can continue mobilizing without any limit or concern. But it is not so. If you go to Russian Stat in the section of population and demography, there is a table there that will tell you that in Russia there are only 20 million men the age of 20 to 40 years old. And you can agree that 20 is not 140. And you also need to consider that about a quarter of these people, they already work in different structures related to military and defense and military industry. So overall number that could be potentially drafted to participate in war activities is decreasing by that number. And by the way, in military industry, they already are facing a huge deficit and lack of personnel, and they've been talking about that. The first Deputy Prime Minister Mantarov in a recent St. Petersburg Economic Forum did mention that the deficit in military industry is about 160,000 people. And by 2026, they're expecting that number to grow to 250,000. The trends of the recent year and a half is a serious flow from civilian industries to the companies of military industrial complex. Understandably, that this is probably a temporary situation, and we cannot prognosticate precisely the time frame for it. But we, in this year and a half, have brought almost 520,000 specialists into the military complex, and we still need 160,000 vacancies to fill. Overall, talking about war and mobilization and related outflow of Russian citizens from Russia proper to other countries around the world, the deficit in personnel is through the roof in different industries there. And I'm talking about that rather often with Michael Naki in our other streams, but you can go to regional news in Russia and see that there are a ton of vacancies. They don't have anyone to work in construction, in services, in logistics and transport, huge deficit of drivers and mechanics and many other professions. For example, such critically important branches as IT and telecommunications. You can see the detailed review up to 700,000 people, and providers in different areas of communication technologies, they just screaming because they have nobody to hire. So in this situation, when one says that Putin can just easily find several 100,000 men to serve in his army and to participate in war against Ukraine, this is not a trivial task. This is not an easy task. We remember how difficult it was during the first wave of mobilization. By the way, in recent times, you could have seen very significant features telling about the deficit of this cadre. That's the video of the passenger bus falling in the Moika River in St. Petersburg, and there were lives lost. And the story there is that the driver was working several shifts, basically have not slept for 2 days, and that is all caused by a simple deficit of personnel at the bus company. Many directors are talking about a large number of their transport just not even being used because they have no drivers. Or another story, a colossal deficit of specialists in the sphere of IT security. Here we have numbers that 2/3 of companies suffer from it, and 40 to 55% is the estimated deficit in this industry of these IT specialists. And what it leads to, you could have seen, as we recently saw with SDEC, delivery service company that was not working for several days because their whole digital infrastructure was down for several days and they just could not work. And there'll be more of these things happening. So overall, talking about the experience of mobilization of the autumn of 22, one can see a very relatable coefficient, 1 to 2. So when Putin sets a task to mobilize 300,000 to participate in the war against Ukraine, it means that another 600,000 to 700,000 people are running. They're fleeing from Russia or somehow otherwise leaving the labor market. And for labor market, losing 1 million people is a catastrophe. All that leads to the fact that they have to mobilize an elderly generation to fight on the front. So according to the numbers provided by Ministry of Defense, an average age of mobilized to the front is 35 years. It's quite a bit. What it means that roughly half of them are the ones older than 40. In this age, it is more difficult to bear physical strain on the front, especially related with offensive operations. So the key conclusion from this is that half of mobilized that are present on the front cannot effectively participate in offensive operations. They cannot run fast and orient themselves in the unknown environment, and they cannot carry that physical strain of participating in the large-scale offensive operation. And at the end of 23rd year, Minister of Defense acknowledged, I think this number grew from then, but they did acknowledge that about 1 million people have reservation from mobilization, because once again, they're already doing some important work, and it's impossible for the military to pluck them for service in this war. Besides that, a huge number of people are just not fit for service according to their health. Looking at the recently published numbers by Ministry of Defense, for example, among the drafted, only 78% are fit for military service, military duty. And this number has actually fluctuated in recent times. They started increasing it, and they're basically considering fit even those who can't really fight. But if we take this number at its face value, 78% means that 22 are considered, even under that pressure, to still be ill-fit for this work. And out of, as we said, 20 million from 20 to 40 people, if you take that proportion, it probably gets worse with age, but then you probably will come to a number of about 5 million people with very questionable probability of drafting them out of those 20. Another story, the analysts from GSP calculated that in Russia, there may be a lot more people with eyesight and hearing problems than the official stats are reporting. I can personally say that I basically do not see anything with one eye, and we even made a small video about that, but I'm not part of that stats. According to their numbers, I'm still somebody who can be drafted, if they could reach me. So one needs to understand that in reality in Russia, we do have about 6.5 million people with problems with eyesight and about 20 million disabled by the hearing problems, and half of them are men. And so you can come to the situation when most likely in this field of men that are supposedly in the draftable age 20 to 40, out of 20 million people, most likely about a third, 5 or more millions, are incapable to carry out these service-related duties. So out of 20 million men, 20 to 40, about a quarter of them already works in military, in security, in military industry. 1 million has a reservation from army because they're specialists that cannot be replaced, and a third cannot serve due to health issues. So then the question is, what is left? And here one can find a very simple explanation why Putin, during the couple years that passed from the first mobilization, has not announced the second wave. I said from the beginning that because of all these reasons, most likely they will never announce it. While many commentators are still screaming that in winter, in spring, by 9th of May, there'll be the second mobilization, and it's not happening. There are real reasons for it, and I was trying to show you in numbers why. It just is not working like this. They do not have an endless human resource to continue fighting. At the beginning of war, Putin's authorities were solving this problem by drafting inmates en masse to send them to front. And that was one of the key ways for them to refit their depleting detachments. But now this opportunity is dwindling, because if at the beginning of war with Ukraine, Russia had about 500,000 of inmates, by the 1st of January of this year, they only have 374,000, out of which over 100,000 are still in jail, not in prison. And there, as you've seen in some publications, that powers are actually trying to draft them from there, those who have not been convicted yet, but with much less success. And in prisons, they have less than 300,000 people. It's difficult to draft those inmates because many of them have health issues as well, and a lot just refuse to fight, understanding, and they have heard all the rumors that is basically a meat grinder. And they understand now that this is not an easy walk, and your chance to live if you get drafted, if you agree to that, your chance to survive is very near zero. And we see how they are lifting the price for those who want to join and sign a contract with the Ministry of Defense. If 2 years ago they were suggesting to pay 200,000 rubles, $2,000, then now we see numbers as 1,300,000, 1,600,000, so up to $16,000. Recent pictures sent to us by viewers. This huge price growth for joining the army only means one thing, that they are running out of people who want to fight even for these money. And most likely Putin has already depleted that potential that society had among the people who were hopelessly deep in credit and those who needed perhaps to get some high expensive medical treatment for his family members. And people were coming to war out of desperation. But the pool of those people who were ready to sacrifice their life for this money, it's dwindling. It was not too big to start with. And looking at this huge price jumps, we can see that. The other story is that soldiers are fleeing the war in droves. And I think this is a correct descriptor. Looking at the numbers, Media Zone is actually tracing the issues, the cases in courts, and now we already have about 1,000 cases a month. And this is just the tip of the iceberg that gets to the court, to the actual prosecution. You can imagine if that's 1,000 a month, what's the real picture is. So overall, it does look like they do not have an endless human resource to continue fighting. And situation looks like Putin can still wade the water for a while. He even tried to create an offensive segment in Kharkiv part, but it failed. His troops are not ready to conduct these operations. They're losing more, and there are no places to refit their detachments. A lot of people have reservations from draft. Military industry is already screaming and trying to find more people. A lot of disabled people, so Putin cannot find enough manpower, manned resources to conduct lengthy war. Crisis in military industry. Next moment is a very serious crisis in Putin's military industry. Everything is not as rosy as some propagandists are telling you on Putin's TV, and some volunteer aides to Putin's propagandists in immigration or in Western media, who somehow think that it's important to say that Russian war machine is fine-tuned and is working to an endless future war. In reality, even if you listen to official bureaucrats in Russia, this is not so. Already quoted Mantarov about hellish deficit of cadre and of personnel in military production. And our listeners know that very often I refer to May interview of Chemizov, published in RBC in May. He is one of the main beneficiaries, the company that gets majority of contracts for production of ammo and arms. And what is he saying? That military companies are working with about zero profit, zero margin. They have about 25% of payments happening in barter, not in money. He talks about the problem with personnel, and that's why there is no way to drastically increase expenditures to produce more ammo and more weapons. Russian industry will not be able to do that. And that's why Putin is very often visiting such countries as North Korea to beg for additional artillery shells and some other things, because his own military industry is failing to provide enough of the growth potential to his troops. And according to Rosstat numbers, we know that the tempo of growth of jets, tanks, armored vehicles, everything that flies and moves, all these complex devices, the production is dwindling because military industry is working at the capacity already. They work 3 shifts, and German Gref was talking about that at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, that capacity is oriented, first of all, to production of military assortment. They're already at capacity and they never faced such a demand before. There's no space to grow. And even in these conditions, they cannot provide any significant growth tempo of military production. We see what's happening on the front, that they are failing to produce new things because they cannot replace the lost units. And one of the signs of it is that you see outdated equipment on the front. They have to refit to bring it from conservation because they're failing to produce new units. And Russia continues to critically depend on the imported components and technologies for military production, which are important from across the border, including the countries in Europe and the West. But this stream is quickly drying up. There was a special report by Kiev School of Economy in January that about a third of components for military production Russia continues to bring in from the West, but they're trying to do it in some gray schemas, and it's getting more and more difficult. And perhaps not so quickly, but all these channels will be closed one way or another. And where Russia will be taking these technologies is very unclear. Here's a simple example. CNC machines and machines for producing of tank guns and artillery guns. Not any simple equipment will do here. Russia and even China do not produce that. These productions in Russia can be counted by fingers on one hand. And Russia was bringing that equipment from the West, but that stream is already out. So what will they do when the aging equipment will start going offline? It's unclear. That's why, looking at the stats, you can see that they stopped growing. They do not have access to technology, they cannot buy new equipment, and Russia cannot produce that equipment by itself. And here we have a couple more interesting moments. First of all is that titanium, very important component used in aerospace, in missile production. And Russia is one of the biggest manufacturers of titanium in the world and was supplying it, by the way, to Boeing and Airbus. But the problem is that Russia is only a processor of that material, and 96% of titanium coming from Russia was brought to Russia from somewhere else to be refined. And before that war, the supplies were mostly purchased in Ukraine. Now this line, of course, for obvious reasons, is non-existent. Why Putin was visiting Vietnam? Vietnam is one of the bigger suppliers of titanium ore to Russia. So if we get this channel cut, then Russia will have serious issues with military production that are dependent on such an important component as titanium. Another story is that huge rate of central bank. You'd think, how is that related to military production, which is supposedly aimed at defeating inflation, but is failing to do so. It also hinders to develop the military production rate. Sergei Chemezov, the head of the biggest Russian military manufacturer, is saying that military manufacturers cannot take credit from banks at such an exorbitant rate because their profitability, their margin is lower, that it cannot provide the return of such a huge rate. And credits military companies can take only if it is subsidized from the budget. And for that, one needs a lot of money. Russia does not have excess money. So we're facing a situation when inflation, central bank politics, and policies related to trying to fix the inflation and increase the rate, all that is also limiting the production capacity. And then secondary sanctions of the West that lead to even Chinese companies and banks freezing their payments with Russia. This leads also to stoppage of critical import components for production. And Minister of Trade Reshetnikov already is saying that he is concerned by the freezing of some of the import channels because some of the critical production capacity is already suffering, including military sector. The next problem is a total crisis and complete meltdown of the logistic systems and supplies provisions in the military. And we told you about that a couple years ago when the full-scale invasion into Ukraine happened. There was a video that we posted, why Putin's army is destitute and incapable. And many people were laughing, they were saying, no, they have a lot of money, they'll fix that. So 2 years later, what do we see? We see two very high-ranking officials of Putin's system, Vladimir Shamanov, who is a high-ranking Duma senator, and he is also a federal commander of the group of Russian troops during the war in Chechnya. So he made a statement that Russian army is basically a partisan group, which is not supplied in any way, and they have to feed themselves. There's no system to support the troops, and it's basically dismantled and corrupted. And people were laughing after his statement, but Then after him, there was another well-known functionary, also general colonel, ex-head of counterintel, ex-prime minister Sergei Stepashin, who basically stated that our military men are destitute and they spend half of the monies they get to buy the bare necessities because government is incapable to provide for them. Let's take a listen. You take a look at the current army. And if you strip down the medals and the fame, those who actually cross inside, they know that the real army looks like the real partisan detachment. They dress at their own expense, at the expense of their relatives, because the quality of government dress is horrible. Whatever they're given by the state, the quality is below any threshold. And that other army, the ones you see on the videos, they're all well dressed, all cared for, but they're not the group of the soldiers that get drafted. They're not the contractors. They're not the ones who get that special treatment. I have a request to our congressman. Look at the basic things. They're obvious. Our soldiers are destitute and they go around asking for food and clothes. Half of the salaries we pay them is being spent to buy their own uniform, to buy bare necessities and food. They go on vacation at their own expense, soldiers and officers. That's an amazing thing. Even back from the Soviet times, those people who don't know, the system of troop supply was built at whatever was left in terms of funding and resources. Those who ever served, they know that the soldier is basically left to provide for himself. And the government just gives you a rifle and some bare uniform. Everything else, it's up to you. Most money spent on the military-industrial complex is usually going to the armored vehicles, munitions. Some money were going to their salaries, but the actual government supply system remained like a Cinderella. To feed for 2.2 million people in Russia and to dress them and everything, it includes heat, dress, fuel, logistics. All that is just 1 trillion rubles. All that for the whole Russia, for over 2 million people, is about 1 trillion rubles, or about $10 billion. And you can talk about different things here, but obviously this is not really corruption. This is just old Soviet principle that I think grows even from the times of Russian Empire. The army will feed itself. They'll figure it out. They'll find food, they'll scavenge, they'll figure it out. And that's the philosophy. 10 billion per year, 0.2 millions is under $5,000 a person per year. That's why one can see that to conduct such a full-scale military offensive with dismantled supplies and logistics system is really an impossibility. So when Putin has to increase the expenditures for military production because they run out of money, because of zero profitability. With the current rate of central bank and commercial banks, manufacturers cannot take credit, and government credit is not available for everybody. So system of logistics, system of supply is crumbled. So soldiers have to feed for themselves. And that means that in order to change things, Russia would need to both add more money to production and add more money to the actual supplies of the army, and just to even catch up with inflation. According to fresh data from Ramir, this is the service that conducts monitoring of the fast-moving consumer goods, FMCG. That's everything that you purchase in a supermarket, over 34% over a year. The growth of prices in May of 24 to May of 23 for basic consumer goods was 34%. Of course, no indexations that already are added to the budget, they do not cover for that growth. And nobody goes to serve, that's why they keep increasing the prices. Now they have reached 1.6 million rubles for the contract. Here we need more money, there we need more money. Where will they get this money? At risk of repeating myself, we have talked at length here that the liquid part of the Fund of National reserve is dwindling. Minister of Finance has serious difficulties borrowing money on the market because the profitability on government bonds are through the roof. And we can make a simple conclusion here. Putin does not have easy money to conduct a lengthy, not even talking about victorious war. Summing it up, Putin does not have resources for a long war. So let's run some totals and try to answer this question. Whether Putin indeed has a capability to continue a lengthy and high-intensity warfare with Ukraine. So, first, problems with personnel. They do not have endless human resource for continuous mobilizations. Perhaps Putin can enforce another round of mobilization at the cost of huge blow to the job market, and creating beyond critical problems in economy. And that's it, because most reserves that are left already work in some military industry, they have reservations and protections, or they have left the country. They do not have available pool of men of the battle-worthy age that he can use. Military productivity is at capacity. 3 shifts, very low profitability, cannot take credit anywhere. Barter is a means of payment. The production slows down. Then we can see that the system of supplies of Putin's army doesn't exist. Some people did not believe me in my previous videos, but okay, listen to such outstanding people in Putin's system, like Generals Shamanov and Stepashin. For all that, they need a lot more money. Not a fact that they will actually earn the monies, because you know that military was pumped with trillions over the last decade, and now we're at a point where they can do just what they can do. No miracle happened there. No miracle will happen again with new Minister of Defense. In his 1.5 months of work at his current capacity, remember how he was praised, how great of a professional he is when he started. So what? So far, besides the collapsed offensive attempt in Kharkov district and some videos of him arguing with the heads of different factories, well, they should have found somebody from a rougher background, not the one with such an intelligent and high middle-class upbringing, because Belousov arguing sounds a bit of a joke. I'm not even talking about his deputy assistants in the Ministry of Defense. I did talk about them in depth with Michael Naki. I will not go into too many details, but these are people who, over their previous decades of work, have not achieved anything anywhere. They have led to collapse in the areas where they worked respectively. Crimea, Donbass, coal in the occupied Ukrainian territories, all that is in destitute and destroyed and crumbled state. As Michael Naki calls them, the team of clowns. So, problems everywhere. No money, no supplies, no anything. A question that remains, what will Putin use to continue fighting? We, in my opinion, are in some peak, top level of the curve at the moment. And for now, he looks generally all right in terms of conducting things in Ukraine and having some capabilities. But this is supposed to collapse as time passes, because these problems are aggregating. Personnel problem is unsolvable. Military industry problem at best can be solved if you pump a lot more money in it, which he doesn't have, and there is not much effectivity in his processes. We know that. And the problem of supplies needs a whole other level of numbers and a whole other level of financing, which Russia doesn't have. So the conclusion is very simple. Putin, for the first time over the last 2.5 years, started talking about peace negotiations. He did not have this rhetoric. Up until recently, he was talking about military operation to the end. So this is one of the signs that many experts foretold that Putin is getting to the point of the limit of his capacity to fight with Ukraine. And all those who are resisting his barbarian aggression need to understand that and refrain from participating in Putin's information warfare with all the titles and slogans that Putin's economy is doing fine. that his economy is surviving under pressure, that his machine is working. His machine is not working. He's talking about negotiations. We need to continue pressing him. We have all the resources, the sanctions work, and we attack him on different sides. We cut his ability to trade. We cut his ability to access technology. This all is already having effect. His official people are already acknowledging it out in the open. So victory over him will not be simple, but as you can see the numbers and everything, it's definitely on the horizon already. This was Vladimir Milov, and I was trying to describe you the overall picture of what's happening in Russian army and Russian military industry with the language of official quotes and official numbers. This is all easy to fact check. You can go dive yourselves. I have not been inventing anything. And here you can just once again come to a conclusion that in the long term, this prognosis, as many of the others that we posted here, will come true. Do not forget to click subscribe. See you next time.